a survey that they did with almost 60,000 consumers that were affected by different types of scams. And it's again global. What's interesting is that they also break it down by the channel that was used to defraud those consumers. And probably not surprisingly, the mobile channel is at the top. And they named their text messaging and voice calls. Email and messaging does also play a role, but definitely text messaging and voice calls was at the top. So clearly a problem that we know, a problem that we do a lot of things in our industry to solve. But in this context, just to share a few things with you here today. For those who don't know netnumber, just here 20 seconds about who we are. So we're a phone number intelligence company. Give us any phone number in the world, and we have data on the phone number that helps with routing, with authentication, fraud prevention. So we have a lot of brands and companies that help us with our data or routing, enhance their processes and prevent fraud. What is phone number intelligence, and in particular number intelligence as a service? You see that the presentation today is highly focused on text messaging. Is not the only thing that we're going to talk about, but given the audience here and also kind of it's the main channel for fraud. We've seen this in many of the sessions that we had earlier. You see that there is a certain bias here for text messaging. So I'll start by speaking about the phone number and the role of the phone number here. The phone number is already an identity, right? So we use the phone number to communicate, we use the phone number to authenticate the services, we use the phone number to pay for different services, micropayments, carrier billing, and stuff like that. So it's powerful in the sense of being able to identify and prevent fraud. People with number portability, people don't change their phone number as often as they used to in the past, so they tend to stick with the phone number of a person, which helps with understanding different aspects of dealing with fraud and things like that. So what's also interesting is that the number is more dynamic than you would think. Less so internationally, so the little box here on the left. Outside of the US, numbers are changing, but they're not changing that often, and there is not so much fragmentation. You might have a number portability database. That's the case in about half the countries globally. That's the maximum number, the maximum amount of dynamism that we have. Numbers might get ported from one operator to another, but that's pretty much it. Even in terms of the entities that will be represented in this number portability databases, there are not many. You need to be some sort of carrier, mobile operator, an online carrier, to be able to own numbering resources in most countries. So you see 5, 10, maybe 15, depending on the approach in the country. But it's not difficult to understand kind of the landscape and who owns the number. In the US, it's much more complex, and this is definitely not a full picture. It's an extract of the picture that's relevant for what we talk today, but much more. Much more data sets, much more registries, each with them with a very important role in the industry, and you kind of need to have all this data together for effective use and in particular for prevention today. I hope the counts are relatively accurate. It's difficult to get some of these statistics right, but in terms of order of magnitude, just trying to understand here how many millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of numbers are in each of this category. Hopefully that's good enough. What's interesting and what's unique to the US is that we can text enable phone numbers. That's something that doesn't exist in other geographies. So take a landline number, take a toll-free number, and messaging capabilities with identifiers like an actual one number. Both an opportunity and also a challenge, as we're going to see here. Another picture just to show how complex data can be. It's focused on the routing use case. Imagine a similar picture for other use cases for authentication, for prevention, but this is something that I believe most of us in the room will be reasonably familiar with, so I use it to illustrate the complexity. Again, the left-hand side is for the US. You see how many data sets you need just to route a single text message effectively. The problem gets compounded when you go internationally. Another 200 countries that you kind of need to understand and observe. Out of these 200 countries, 110, 120 have number portability, so you need to have the data as well to understand if the numbers are valid, if the numbers are, what carrier operates them, and so on and so forth. And many countries don't even have central number portability databases. They, you need to use other real-time ways of getting the data. So it can get really complex. And here the value is something that we do, and many, there are others that really kind of bring all this data together and exposing it into, single API, single commercial model. If you're a brand, you can't deal with this fragmentation. You might have the expertise locally, but you don't have the expertise globally. It's just too much. So, it's important to bring all these pieces together and exposing them in a simplified way to those who need it. And kind of to link this to the fraud prevention aspect of it, so, for fraud prevention it's important to have all this data centralized and real-time. Real-time is important. Fraudsters, have typically a short lifespan of using certain numbering resources. They move quickly from number to number in order to, stay under the radar, get undetected. So, information that was valid yesterday is no longer today. And it's an example that I've seen recently, I've heard about recently. So again, a brand might be an expert locally, but having all this data on an international basis is difficult for some of them. And what happens is that oftentimes those who don't have the right information, they tend to overreact, or they tend to block communication that would otherwise be perfectly legitimate because they don't have the data to determine what's right and what's wrong. So the example that I wanted to mention, so I've heard actually of someone, they tried to call from a regular mobile phone in the US to a regular landline number in Australia, and the Australian operator didn't have the right data to determine if the caller ID actually is a legitimate caller ID of the US subscriber, so they decided to block the call. So this is a clear example where by trying to implement fraud prevention but not having the right data, you block what is essentially legitimate communication. So jumping into text messaging more specifically, again, interesting, and in US brands have more options than internationally, with multiple types of identifiers or sender IDs that also call for brands. From 10 DLC that's launched a few years ago, and it's now mature, to toll-free numbers that can be text-enabled and used for messaging communication into short codes. So a lot of choice, but this also comes, as I mentioned earlier, with a certain degree of complexity and communication. What are the trends and the challenges in terms of business messaging? We heard some of these in the earlier presentations. RBM, definitely, we all want RBM to be successful. There is still fragmentation. If we look at how the RBM agents get approved, there is still no unified way of doing this globally. What's the carrier's responsibility, what's the Google responsibility there, and we're still not at 100% coverage. So at least for the foreseeable future, and we've seen this, there was a chart with kind of showing how WhatsApp, and I think it was in the Sinch presentation, WhatsApp and RBM and SMS will continue to evolve. SMS remains important as a complement, as a failover for those subscribers that are not yet reachable via RBM. And then it's also the question that I don't know if anyone really has the answer yet. Is RBM actually going to be at 100% penetration at some point, or is there going to be this fragmentation between RBM and other messaging apps? And we've seen, we talked about WhatsApp, but if you look at Asia, there is even more fragmentation in between WeChat, Line, and Kakao, and some others depending on the country. So based on how things stand today, it's really difficult to imagine a future where this fragmentation will magically disappear. P2P RCS, a really good technical explanation from Mike from Proofpoint there. End-to-end encryption, no content. You can no longer use the previous content inspection to understand if there is fraud or not. It's even more important to use other information about phone numbers, phone number intelligence, phone number reputation to determine if, and feedback loops to determine if there is if a certain message is legitimate or not. And yeah, last but not least, network APIs, again, really powerful. They simplify a lot of use cases. Silent authentication is really beautiful in terms of making login and authentication more secure as opposed to OTP SMS. Penetration is still a challenge there, right? So
I think we've seen 30 carriers that launched in the Aduna presentation. If you look at countries that have complete coverage, so 80–90% of the subscribers in a given country being covered, it's probably 10 or 12. So we're still, far away from having this as a universal service that can actually replace more of the SMS, A2P SMS use cases. So what do you do if you're a brand? You embrace them because they simplify the user experience, but you also need to continue using SMS as a complement, as a fallback for virtually, the rest of the world where there are no network APIs to do that. So, my view on the future is that while these things continue to grow and evolve, RCS, RBM, network APIs, SMS will continue to play a role, and then the add-on of phone number intelligence to ensure that this communication gets to the right person, but it's also legitimate communication that's been from fraud. I'll jump in two regulatory things that I think are relevant. So first of all, sender ID registration. That's something that outside of the US, it's the trend now. If you're a regulator outside of the US, you're considering launching a sender ID registry. And the thing here is, so some examples here, probably one of the strictest is the one in Singapore where it's mandatory to register sender IDs, otherwise the text messages get blocked. I think Australia is looking at doing something pretty similar. Ireland is considering, it's just 3 examples, there are many others, and even in Europe, I think some, Northern European and Italy, they have stuff like that. So, clear regulators recognize that text messaging is abused as a channel, and they look at sender ID registration as a way to mitigate that. What's unfortunate here is that they often focused on alphanumeric sender IDs. Alphanumeric sender IDs don't exist in the US, but they do exist in most or many of the non-US geographies. You can, until a few years ago, you could declare any alphanumeric sender ID as for a message, Mickey Mouse, Santa Claus, whatever. There were no restrictions. Now the operators kind of restrict that. But there is still too much freedom so that even fraudsters can, register alphanumeric sender IDs, and oftentimes they will vary a character or something like that, or use Unicode and some others, character codings. They make it look the same, but it's completely different. And the problem is that, they abuse a brand that's well known, and alphanumeric makes it really easy to confuse the brands. So the regulators are coming and saying, we're going to have sender ID registries for alphanumeric sender IDs. That's perfect. So again, as per Mike's presentation earlier, maybe you remove spoofing, but brand impersonation will continue to exist. If you're not covering the entire spectrum, short codes, numbers, that's going to be a problem. Things like chain of custody, the entire messaging delivery channel that contains multiple hops, multiple aggregators connect to each other. They're using local experts to deliver messages. This is typically ignored, right? So you're registering maybe the first hop, but that's where you stop. So not so much a problem in the US, because here in terms of text messaging, we have already existing registries, short codes, long codes, toll-free. This is something that has been working for a while, and it's working differently, and it's pretty robust. In one of the FCC report and orders, they acknowledge that spoofing is virtually not a problem in the US because the way that things are implemented here. Another thing that comes up often, both in the US and internationally, DNO do not originate. So is this phone number allowed to be a caller ID for a voice call or a sender ID for a text message? In the US specifically, there's been already obligations to use DNO for certain category of service provider. Wireless service providers were obliged to use DNO data DNO data for text messaging. Gateway providers were obliged to use DNO data for voice calls. Now the SEC came recently, I think it's the 8th report in Northern robocalling, saying that all the voice service providers now have to use DNO data. So the scope has been significantly expanded. And again, internationally, each country is kind of doing their own thing. In the UK, there is a DNO list that Ofcom is managing. I think Australia is also looking at doing some things, but definitely a topic that will continue to evolve. And both from a sender ID perspective, sender ID registration perspective, and DNO perspective, as with data fragmentation in general, if you're a brand, if you're a global company, you kind of need to know locally in each country what the requirements are and then go and source the data locally, or use one of the services that aggregate this and make it easy for you to implement sender ID registration policies that are valid across the world. So let's jump into fraud prevention now here. So what are the different fraud types and what's the difference here, US versus non-US? Many similarities, many differences. So, social engineering, phishing, financial fraud, this is kind of, universal and, varying degrees of how serious they are depending on the country, but they tend to exist in all the countries. What's more prevalent in the US is robocalling and robotexting. This is why you also see all the, industry efforts and also the FCC efforts on trying to, reduce this. Internationally, it's a big problem in terms of artificially inflated traffic, artificially generated traffic, revenue share, fraud, and stuff like that. So yeah, the text messaging ecosystem has evolved in a way that's definitely not positive, and this is why many brands have already started moving away from text messaging for some of the use cases. Yeah, we heard the Google example recently, where they're using alternative, authentication mechanisms like, network APIs and QR codes instead of SMS OTP, and other brands are being reluctant because they've got issues with AIT in particular over the past few years. So again, there are solutions for this. I've listed some from the ones that we're offering. There are others on the market. So these are problems, but there's also ways to go around them. Something specific to netnumber that we've announced recently, I want to spend a minute or two on this. So the fraud prevention registry, that's something that we announced a few weeks back. If you think of other industries, like in particular the internet industry, there's been already there have been ways to share data about fraudulent IP addresses, fraudulent domains. It's really fast and quick and effective to switch to shut down a bad domain these days. It's not so easy when you come to the telecom space. Data share, information sharing is something that's often discussed, but it's not done as much as it should in practice for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons is that there is no such central place that makes it easy to provide data about fraudulent behavior, fraudulent numbers if you have it, but then also consume it in an easy and streamlined way. So something that we've done in this space, this fraud prevention registry, a place that has, it's about phone numbers, and it's about phone numbers that have been associated with some sort of fraud. There are, bad senders, phone numbers that are sending, for example, phishing links or malware links to, bank users or other subscribers. And then on the other hand, victim numbers or phone numbers that have not done anything wrong, but they were, these are regular subscribers that are, their numbers have been collected via phishing campaigns, or they're part of data breaches. And the problem with these types of behavior is that it's not just the phone number that gets collected by fraudster, it's also the other metadata about the subscriber, their name, their address, the bank they use, whatever. So these are really targeted attacks, and they go and try to defraud that subscriber in a lot of ways using the data that they've collected. And from our perspective, what's important if you're a brand, if your customers are on this list of victims or potential victims, they're at the higher risk of certain types of fraudulent behavior. Their accounts might get taken over and stuff like that. So if you see a high value transaction, or if you see a sensitive transaction happening with one of your users that's on this list, then typically you want to introduce some additional steps, some additional friction to make sure that they are not targeted by a fraudster. So we're in the process of expanding this with the industry. We've started with WMC Global as a partnership. In terms of partnership, we announced this when we launched it, but we're working with industry now to expand this to more data contributors. No matter if you're from the telco space, you're from financial institution space, other types of brands might have really good fraudulent information about fraud. That's worth for the industry to share. But then also, we have already in the millions of phone numbers that are here, and they are used as we speak to identify and stop fraud. So yeah, this concludes my presentation.
and we're going to do a bit of fireside chat, kind of trying to unpack some of the topics or content that you presented. So to kick off, I think you talk about the problem itself, how huge it is. $1 trillion is no small change. You talk about the fraud, the issue, and why it has to be handled. We understand that. You've mentioned about the different layers of registry and fraud prevention, components that are available, especially in North America. And then you also talk about like what you guys are doing within the fraud prevention registry. So I guess the question is, your call to action is that that's one of the layer, one of the mechanism available for the ecosystem to prevent fraud. So from a carrier and service provider, your call to action is to let's come and join us and contribute your data to the fraud prevention registry. So what's in it for them? Why would they want to do it? And what kind of data? Is it just a phone number? Or, so give us a bit more details around that.
Yeah, on the why, two things. So first of all, it's about disrupting fraudulent behavior faster, more effectively. And then it's about preventing fraudsters from being able to move from hop to hop as they do today. So today the typical behavior is that with the same phone numbers they might attack a certain bank or the customers of that bank, but then they can use the same numbers to then move to another bank, because fraud prevention kind of takes place in silos. And I can expand this to carriers and CPaaS providers and virtually everyone now, because this information it might be shared on a bilateral basis, but it's definitely not shared across the entire industry. It's not a lot of fraudsters don't need a lot of time and resources and effort. They can use the same resources which they set up in the beginning for quite some time before they get detected by everyone and shut down. So yeah, this is an attempt here really to make fraud prevention real time. If a partner of the fraud prevention registry identifies a certain type of fraudulent behavior, all the other partners have access to the data right away in real time. So then the time to disruption gets shortened.
Okay. Yeah. And maybe to extend that to the enterprise, especially if you are doing a big enterprise, doing large scale messaging, voice campaign, what are the benefits? And how does it improve their deliverability, their reputation, trust factor? So what is it for the enterprise?
Yeah. So on one hand, the enterprises are helping carriers, CPaaS providers, so essentially the ones that are running the traffic, receive the information about the fraud that might happen with their users faster and disrupt that type of behavior. On the other hand, if those enterprises consume the data and they have access to everything that's in there, and in particular the victim numbers, which are really powerful, as I mentioned in the presentation. If your customer is on that list, you'd need to do some additional checks if they are trying to transfer a large amount of money, if they're trying to reset the password, because that might be actually a fraudster trying to do that.
We do have a few minutes, so I want to open up any questions to the audience. But okay, if not, I just want to kind of maybe conclude. I think it's a great initiative, and I think ones that we need to kind of have a conversation more around this. I guess the question is, sharing the data. There's a skeptics out there. Well, how do I participate? Talking to you obviously, and see how the conversation could go in participation, because that's basically what your call to action is. If somebody's hesitant, what are your message to somebody who say, well, I'm not sure, let me think about it, what are your message out there?
Yeah, so two things there really. So from definitely, people might be hesitant from a data privacy perspective. The fraud prevention registry doesn't have any, personal information besides the phone number itself. And then obviously with more parties contributing, then this data kind of gets correlated, and you get the power of being able to understand, is this number reported by one entity, by 5 entities, what's the frequency of reports, what's the last report. So it gets really powerful. But yeah, beyond the phone number and then metadata like the one that I described, trying to assess the impact of a certain type of fraud. There is no, there are no names of subscribers and stuff like that. From a technical standpoint, it's also pretty easy. So, contributing data, we can use, files, we can use an API process, and the same on the consumption side. We have a pretty robust API that makes it easy to consume the data. So, yeah, and definitely, for those.
And question, like, this is available today in North America.
It's available and in use with our customers.
Right, exactly. So, there's enterprise and CPaaS can use the data today because it is available, at least for North America.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. So please join me actually to thank Catalin Badea from netnumber.